Exactly right.
We cued the weather. The weather's perfect.
So I don't want to delay things.
Joe, should we roll? Are you in charge?
Yeah,
Should we go for it?
you're the boss. You're the ringmaster. You're the ringmaster. You get to decide when.
Do I turn this on? Can you all hear me probably? Okay, guys, I think we're going to get started. My name is Mark Bell. I, among other things, have been privileged to teach in the business school for almost 2 decades, and for the last 3 to 5 years have been a visiting professor in QTM, now known as Data and Decision Sciences. And so it has been a privilege of myself and my wife Bianca to sponsor today's talk. And we're excited to bring together both this world of newness, new computers, data science, AI, and what I think is the original discipline, that of the study of history. And so we have with us, I have some official words here, we have distinguished Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington, who is a Rhodes Scholar. She has only made one mistake in life. She studied at Merton College instead of Balliol, my alma mater, but she did her master's and PhD there. She holds a DPhil in history, and her DPhil explored the work of Collingwood's and his understanding of the historical imagination. She has a global profile as a historiographer, and since 2020, she has published a series of papers on AI and history, most recently Artificial Historians, which is published by Routledge in 2025. Her next book will be History and Artificial Intelligence, coming out of Cambridge, 2025, we hope, but certainly by 2026. She's proud to collaborate with Professor Joe Goldie, who's here from Emory, in advancing her user safety and understanding of uncertainty and AI outputs, which focuses on the past. So it's really my privilege to have a scholar of this quality and expansive use of the true sense of the university, of coming across many disciplines to talk to us today. So join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. And I do want to acknowledge Mark and Bianca. Thank you very much for your generosity in supporting this event. I want to say how excited I am to be here at Emory. And I just want to do an accent check. Can you understand me? Oh, excellent. Tell me to slow down at any point, so you just use your hands to do that. I want to thank Joe for the invitation to be here. And this is a great opportunity to bring the many disciplines in my life together and to talk about something that I think has get everybody talking and interested. So the topic is this: when will AI win a Pulitzer Prize for history? Now, historians of the room, I'm going to start with something that's potentially upsetting, so please don't take it personally. But I'm going to remind you of a paper in July of this year when Microsoft produced a research paper which described the level of affinity between what Copilot can do and particular professions. And it identified that there was the highest rate of user satisfaction with the outputs produced by people that were engaged in translation inquiries and history inquiries. And so history made number 2 on the list of the disciplines where people thought that Copilot could do the job just as well. Right down the bottom of the list was a dredge crane operator. So that's just to put it in context for you. The more manual the task, the more it was seen that AI couldn't do it. The more that it involved desktop research, the more there was deemed to be alignment. In the hands of the press, this became AI is going to replace historians. So it went from people are happy with what Copilot is doing with history queries to you're all now on the verge of extinction, you're in deep trouble, and then us having to defend ourselves, or apparently unfazed by AI, on the argument that our methodologies are really, really interesting and that we're distinctly human. So that's the opening for this talk. And I do want to say that there's actually obviously a lot of interest in the topic. There's also anxiety. And so wherever you're coming from in this topic, I just want to acknowledge that people have a range of feelings about AI. That's perfectly fine. I do think the more we talk about it as historians, the more that we can find ourselves in this topic, the more we can contribute to the design of AI rather than just the usage of AI. So I'm going to package it up in this question of, can an AI win a Pulitzer Prize for history? Now, of all the prizes around the world globally, this one's got a pretty good shot for an AI for a couple of reasons. The first is the eligibility rules are actually distinctly non-specific about humans. So to enter the Pulitzer Prize, you need to produce simply a work that's published in the United States for purchase by the general public. Now, when you produce a work, copyright is assigned to that work. Now, in the US Constitution, it talks about intellectual property and copyright, but it never says anywhere that the author has to be human. And there have actually been court cases in the US where people tried to argue that a monkey was an author of an artwork, and that was struck down. So it's by precedent that an author is understood as a human in the US, whereas in the UK, under the Wolfson Prizes rules, actually IP is assigned to persons with bodies. So in the US, there's this assumed meaning that it is a human, but here you could actually produce a work, and if you were non-human, you could assert the right to copyright, it just wouldn't be recognised, and your work would be freely available and easily copyable. So it's possible that a non-human could actually enter a work into the Pulitzer Prize. It's possible. The two other criteria for a Pulitzer Prize for history is that it's a distinguished work in the history of the United States and it's appropriately documented. And we're going to look at those two things in turn. What I love about this prize, along with the Wolfson, the Kundal, lots of other book prizes around, the criteria for judging the prize are curiously non-specific, right? So a distinguished work is what the board recognises a distinguished work to be, which is really interesting, really, really interesting. And that's going to give us some fruit for thought. So let's start with perhaps one of the simpler areas, an appropriately documented work. So could an AI actually produce an appropriately documented work? This is something that's causing a lot of concern about the creation of false citations. And in fact, in Australia last week, the first lawyer was actually sanctioned by the courts for producing legal advice with made-up citations. And the Supreme Court actually, put some sanctions on that lawyer. And there's been some cases in the US where lawyers have generated works with false citations, and they've also been sanctioned. This is from a work from 2023, and interestingly enough, this paper, which is in Nature Scientific Reports, they invented a lot of queries, they put it out, and then they checked the citations to see how accurate or not accurate ChatGPT was. What I love about this paper is if you go and look at the data behind the paper, the majority of the questions that they asked GPT were actually historical questions. So I found this one really interesting because it's pretty much testing, can it actually write a history accurately? And what you find is that GPT-4 is more accurate than 3.5, so it's getting better, and it's most accurate with actually books, which is really interesting, which is the main form of currency for historians, certainly around the world. Not as accurate for journal articles, least accurate for book chapters. So there's a sort of more fine-grained view here that it's better on some things and not on others. What's missing from this list is any mention of archives or data. So while the majority of the questions that were being framed around the study were around history, there's actually no recognition of what's the oil of history. So what do we put in order to get a history report? Not there at all. It's an assumption that a history works on secondary sources. Now, as a historiographer, I'm pretty excited by that. That means I've got a pretty good chance, if I design an AI to write a historiography book, that it's probably got more shot of being accurate and entering the Pulitzer Prize, okay? So that's the state of the field as it is, and I'll come back to this one in due course. I want to then flip now to look at what a distinguished book is. So the thing about the Pulitzer Prize is the variety of topics. It's extraordinary. And for a non-US citizen like me, reading the Pulitzer Prize history books, the shortlist, the recommended books, it is absolutely an extraordinary journey into US history. I'd have to say that I've learned things about US history that I never ever learned at school, that I would say are deeply enriching, rich and incredible journeys into US history in lots of different ways. In the course of the book that I've just written, and I'll talk to you about it in just a moment, I looked at the shortlists and the winning books for the Pulitzer Prize, the Wolfson Prize, the Cundall Prize, for about 9 or 10 different prizes, including the Newbery Medal and also the Scott Award, which are both for children as well. And I wanted to look at what history books actually look like. What are they? What topics do they actually cover? And as I say, the thing that struck me was that a Pulitzer Prize winning book has got a lot of variety to it. But here's the question, and this is where AI becomes really, really interesting. If you look at the history of AI, there's something that you glean that helps us to think about this collection of books in a way that I don't think historians of AI have actually realised. If you look at histories of AI, they're much more constellated around an agreed argument. If I took the Pulitzer Prize set, they're much more diverse in terms of the arguments, but if you look at the history of AI, they tend to follow the same periodisation, they tend to highlight the same topics, and pretty much all of them, amazingly, talk about this turning point in AI. They argue that in the 80s you see a switch in AI from people who design problems and symbolic logic upfront to program a computer to do things, to actually inputting, labelling data sets, and the computer's learning from those data sets. There's no absence of logic in the second version. It's just that you're actually working much more with empirical evidence, you're labelling the evidence, and you're getting the machine to learn over time how to label that evidence to find things in common and anomalies. So this previous set of histories, very diverse. This set of histories, much more constellated. And what they get us to think about is, well, maybe if we look at the group of Pulitzer Prize winning histories, we can learn what one is by looking at the examples. AI would suggest that if I took all of the Pulitzer Prize winning histories, I scanned them, I went and looked at them, if I could do that legally, morally, respectfully, I could find out what a Pulitzer Prize winning history is, okay? In a way, I didn't do it mechanically or via machine learning, but in this book, what I did was I went and analysed lots of history books, over 100 of them that won prizes, to try and figure out what's the fingerprint of a human versus a machine. Could I tell the difference between those two things? What would it come down to? And across the book, I looked at, for instance, how historians work with chronology, with space, with questions, with personal pronouns, with modals, with all kinds of things. And I'm not going to go through all of those today. I'm going to focus on one element, which I find really interesting, and at the moment seems to be distinctly human in an explicable form. And I'll explain that in just a moment. So it's this. When you look at the Pulitzer Prize winning histories, as you look at all the histories that I looked at, there's, unsurprisingly, I think, as an historian, nice use of what we call conditionals. Ifs, buts, maybes, possibles, mights of history. Historians trade in these interesting words, these conditionals, that they place around their arguments. You don't just find it in one topic, you find it persistently across topics. Numerically, what would it be? In the Pulitzer Prize winning histories that I read over the previous decade, typically 30 to 60 conditional questions in these histories per book. If I looked at the mass data of AI, it wouldn't stand out. But just looking at history texts, they stand out to you. They tend to come towards the end of the book. They tend to be open-ended and unresolved. They're invitations for the reader to consider things, to think about possibilities. You find them in children's books as well as in adult books. So the ifs, buts, maybes of history are really interesting. And I was interested in what they do and why people use them. So the focus of this little discussion with you is the if-thens of history and the what-if-thens of history, the conditionals and the counterfactuals. And I know some of you are really interested in conditionals in data science, and you're also interested in counterfactuals. And let me just acknowledge that data scientists and historians and econometricians, we talk about these things, we don't all see them the same way. So I might use the language of talking about these things that seems a bit unfamiliar to you, but please, I'm coming at the perspective of what historians would think in this space. If you're an historian, let me know if you think I'm really off beam and got it wrong, okay? So what do we think about the ifs and the mights of history? Why do they matter? Well, looking at these books, there's a couple of theories or hypotheses that I think are worth testing around them. The first is I think they're interesting because they convey possibility. And I'm giving you some little examples of some sentences there. X happened, if X happened, what if X happened, X might have happened, right? Sub out X and put in any event you like. On the right-hand side, let me give that example to you. That's Tia Miles's book, All That She Carried. It's a cloth sack that's got some embroidery on it. And in this beautiful book, Tia Miles goes chapter by chapter and says, if the sack was this, it could have been used for that. What if the sack was this? It could have been used for that. X, the sack happened to be this. The sack might have been this. Chapter by chapter by chapter. The beautiful thing about this book is there's no chapter at the end that says, this is the right one. It's left completely unresolved. It's not problematic. What she's done is she's used all these conditionals and modals to convey possibility. You might have come to that book thinking one thing around that sack, and she's taken us on a journey and said, it's at least 8 things. And I want to remind you that sometimes seeing it 8 ways is good, because it reminds you that people come from different positions of power, experience, and history. It's a really lovely technique to remind you. I might look and say that's the letter M, you see it's the letter W. We might be both right, and that's the beauty of history. Evidence is interpretable in these different ways. But it's also used as a sign of responsibility. Saying it might have happened is kind of saying to you, I'm not entirely certain. I'm not entirely certain that it did happen this way. I'm putting a rider on this because I need you to know that I'm not 100% sure. And if I'm not 100% sure, it could be that more evidence might be found in future. But also, if you looked at this stuff, you might have a different view. It's both a reminder of the limitations of the study and an invitation for you to participate in the study as well. It's used both ways. Importantly, these conditionals and modals, they support this profound creativity and responsibility, both together. It's all these possible worlds, but not all possible worlds. They're used in non-probabilistic ways, so Tia Miles doesn't say chapter 1 is 5% true, chapter 2 is 10% true, 15, 20, right through. She doesn't do that. It's non-computable. They're all possible. What I love about this is that in my upbringing in philosophy, we were often taught that the past was fixed, but the future was full of possible worlds. Here are historians reminding us, actually no, the past is full of possibilities, and those possibilities could shape possibilities in the future. Branching logic is not one way, it goes both ways. And both ways have limitations. It's not acceptable to say that aliens put the sack in the book. We have rules around acceptable numbers of worlds, acceptable ranges of worlds in terms of both agency and systematic exclamations. So these conditionals are nifty little vehicles for reminding us what's possible and what's permissible. That's a hefty load for a bunch of little words. So much riding on the word if. And if I'm a reader sitting out there, do I get it? And this is the question we're going to look at now. Do I get it? And does AI get it? As I say, there's lots of other things we could look at, but this one I think is really, really interesting. It doesn't get it. It doesn't get it. So this is a paper from this year. It's a really interesting paper looking at large language models and what people think they know. It's a comparison of the kinds of explanations that LLMs give to people, the degree of confidence that people have in those explanations, and whether they believe them. The moral of the story on this one is, the longer the answer of the LLM, the more likely people are to believe it. The fewer or no conditionals that are used, the more likely people are to trust it. No conditionals, long answer, most trustworthy. Pop a question at the end in first person. Can I help you anything more with this? That's called advisability, and you have a trusted text, an accepted text, and a product that a person wants to use again. So hold on a minute, you say, hang on a minute. We've got a bunch of historians that are trading in these beautiful conditionals. They're so subtle, it's about possibility, creativity, limitations, and you're telling me that an LLM doesn't do those things. And for those of you who are teaching students at the moment, that's the red hot tip, isn't it? If you're wanting to find AI-generated text, go and count the conditionals. If you can't find them, it's more likely to have been synthetically generated by AI at the moment. Okay, so if you want to find this in your classroom, this is it. So that's their study from this year. There's another one that's just as interesting on the mites of history, and this one's connected to ethics. And this is a great little paper, also from this year, where these authors, and again, these are all Nature papers, which I absolutely love, they were trying to establish, is AI more moral than humans? And they compared people's trust and belief in the New York Times ethics columnist versus AI. And AI won. Drat. That's really disappointing. Maybe ethicists should be on that list of advisable things. Why? Because the AI was more moral, more positive, and more empathetic than the human. Now, the moral came from the use of terms from the Moral Foundations Dictionary. So using particular vocabulary actually was deemed to be more moral. It also used more modals. Should, could, would, might, must. It used heavier modals. So the word like might suggests that you might want to do something, but if I said that you must do something or should do something, that's more directional. AI used the heftier modals, must, should, rather than might. So stronger language, but it was positive about it, and it was empathetic. I understand you're having a problem with this. Can I help you with that? Again, deemed to be more trustworthy. Conversely, when you actually look at putting these things together, if you test LLMs on using conditionals and these modals, the ifs, the buts, the maybes, the possibles, they don't perform very well at all. In fact, put them together, if she might have been invited to X, it doesn't do very well at all, right? Not at all. So the argument could be that the majority of people in ordinary web language are just not using modals and conditionals. That's an argument. It could be an argument that most people don't know how to trade in these modals and conditionals, so you might as well just pull them out anyway. Don't bother programming them. One, because they're really hard, and two, because people don't want them. And that's a really interesting meeting space, isn't it? What if we were using words like if because we want our students to be responsible? What if we were using words like might because we want our students to think creatively? And what if we missed one another because students were increasingly using these AI that aren't using this vocabulary and historians are? Like ships in the night, we pass by one another and we might have a communicative problem. So this is where it gets really interesting, because it's only a problem on the output side. On the interior of the machines, we all know that modals are being thought about. Probability is the trading of AI. There are ifs, there are weighted parameters in AI, but they're on the inside of AI. They're not on the outside of AI. Why not? What does this say about people's assumptions about history? If we recall the surveys around where people most connect with history in the public, so the great work of Rosenzweig and Swellen, the AHA study from 2 years ago, the majority of people connect with history in visual forms. Streaming services, photographs, films. That's where people find history. The language of those forms is not a written if or a but or a maybe. I think there are visual forms of explaining if and but and maybe, but they're not literal forms of it and but and maybe. So picture this. Machines that are trained on a big corpus in which historians are just but a tiny part. And they're trained to produce an output for people that are used to seeing history in particular formats with visual forms of language, but not the specialised forms of language that we might have invested much in. And a final word on if and but and maybe before we move on. And I say this as an Australian, lovingly. We're a middle power. We're not a superpower, okay? And I know there's some Kiwi connection here as well. We're not superpowers. We're middle powers. We often use the words if and but and maybe because we don't want to pick a fight. We want to produce a work that's respectful to our colleagues, suggests that there's some uncertainty and some creativity, but is diplomatic as well. So this is a usage of conditionals and modals I haven't talked about, but when you look at first-person pronouns in histories and modals, they're often used as a form of diplomatic trading. I need to be respectful to everybody that's come before me. I don't want to pick a fight with them, but I am going to put my own explanation forward, and I'm going to use possibly and maybe just to dampen the temperature down. Historians write in middle power language. Geopolitically interesting, isn't it? Kind of Australian language. So that's a kind that I haven't talked about, but interestingly too, that's on the back end in AI. It's not in the front end. And our users, our students, might not understand this vocabulary very well at all if they're connecting one way and we're talking in another way. When they hand in a piece of AI writing, they may think that you're not going to see it because the conditionals wouldn't occur to them as being important to that. If I ask my students, what do you need to do to make it look like a history? I say, footnotes. Made up or real, it just needs footnotes. They haven't spotted that clever use of words. It's not a probabilistic model at all. So this is our conundrum. How do we get people to understand and explain AI in ways that are responsible and creative, that recognise the possibilities of the parameters in an LLM, because it can be fine-tuned to be more or less creative, can be fine-tuned to be more or less safe. How can we do that? And this is the insight we have. The important thing for me is, let's think about AI this way. AI for me is not just about the future. It is a profoundly historical discipline. AI trades on data from the past. It identifies anomalies and recommendations on the basis of matches and things that don't stick from the past. It learns from the past, it learns from experience. It is an historical discipline. It has its own language of ifs and buts and maybes, probabilistically explained. But it doesn't bring that out to the front end in the way that historians do. So could we connect the dots between where our students and our audience are and where AI is? This is why I'm at Emory, and this is why I'm really excited about this work. I think that we could walk in the direction of our readers a little bit more and think about simpler, more visual ways of signalling possibility and responsibility, the conditionals and the modals of history. For much as I absolutely adore Pulitzer Prize winning histories, I have to acknowledge that spending decades studying histories, I'm a real history nerd, you get to see those subtleties in there and you really enjoy them. But it takes years and years and years to learn that. And our students might not get that. As I say, it's passing them by. So I've given you a couple of examples here, and I've given you examples that are dear to Australians' hearts, which is the price of housing. We love talking about housing. Here's two simple visual models. One of them is actually a local app, which shows you the estimated price of a house, the range of the price, and on the right-hand side, the rent price. The bottom is the Australian example, which is, here's the lower end of the range, the mid and the high range of the price of this house, and the little confidence interval is on the left-hand side. It's high, it's green. I can see that it's green. It says 670K in green. Highly confident that it's worth about 670K. It's explained it really, really simply, right? Really nicely and probably more intuitively than the top one. A visual language has been identified to help people to understand it's not an exact price. There's some noise, there's some confidence things that you need to think about. They've walked in the direction of their users. So could we as historians and data scientists figure out more visual language for explicability in AI? Because this is, I think, the greatest challenge of our time. It's not just Pulitzer Prize winning histories that use ifs. It's every statement about a pharmaceutical therapeutic drug. You have a 5% chance of this, you have a 10% chance of this. There are histories of particular, trading to commodities. There's uncertainty everywhere in any kind of data that ranges over time. So it's not just historians that have a stake in this, we all have a stake in understanding uncertainty and possibility in the AI. So how could we develop models on the front that help people to do that? That's, I think, our goal. As I've painted AI as a field based on history, on understanding the past, I think historians have a critical role to play in developing those ways of expressing possibility and responsibility. And I think data scientists can help us work towards that. This is why this talk matters to me, is to have the two greatest friends in my life in the same room. Can we do this together for the benefit of helping people to understand the information that's in front of them, the certainty and the uncertainty? So I'm going to round it back by coming back to that question of, can an AI win a Pulitzer Prize for history? Well, what can it do now? Well, it can already register to apply. Doesn't need to be human, and I thank the US law for that. The ambiguity about what an author is means that an AI could enter the Pulitzer Prize next year and give it a red hot go, as we say in Australia. It couldn't enter the Wolfson Prize. It needs to be a person that's resident and IP is attached to a person. It could enter the Kundal Prize because, again, it describes a work, not an author. It couldn't enter an Australian Book Prize because you need to be a citizen of Australia. So if you know anybody that's on the Pulitzer jury, I'd be recommending they might want to think about their eligibility rules. Because at the moment, an AI could actually enter. It doesn't own the copyright, but it could publish a book. It could actually publish a book. What's coming soon? Well, I think there is an improvement in documentation accuracy. It's not great, but it is getting better. It is improving. We're seeing improvement over time. But I also want us to consider a couple of other opportunities. Could we imagine a world in which the Pulitzer Prize is given to any application of AI that uses data from the past in the US? Not just a book, but what if you were to develop an LLM, for instance, that actually did a really great job of telling US history? Could that win a Pulitzer Prize? I would love to see the jury expand its notion of what a history is in the way that it has done so for journalism. For journalism, you can have images, short stories, long stories. History is just a book. Well, we all know that most people know that history is a film. It's an AI entry. So maybe there's an opportunity to broaden. And what is needed now, and this is the big one, that book or that work offers visual and intuitive ways of signalling uncertainty and possibility in learning about that data from the past. And that's not just for responsibility's sake. I actually also think it's very important for safety. Because X happened, X might have happened. If X happened, what if the word X was Holocaust? How do we feel about that? Getting it right really matters for our readers. It's not just a nice to have. It is actually fundamental to social cohesion and respect. It's also important, I think, for service standards. I shouldn't just be able to go to an AI and get a history essay quickly produced. I want to know as a reader that I'm getting something good. That service standard at the moment is built around rapidity of response. We actually deserve accuracy of response and recognition of uncertainty of response as well. And so that's why I'm here at Emory, very pleased to be collaborating with Joe. Our current project is we are looking at the history entries in Wikipedia in all of its languages, so over 100 languages. We are comparing the dates that are in those languages to see how much agreement and disagreement there is. We're also going to look at the logical structure of those entries as well to see how much agreement and disagreement there is. On chronology, we can tell you that as far as we can see at the moment, that World War I and World War II and 1980 stand out as global periodization in all of the Wikipedia entries. World War I and World War II we understand, 1980 we don't, so if you've got an explanation, please let us know. You've got a theory, but I think I'd really like to know. We're trying to get a global view of Wikipedia in order to do that. But the reason we're doing it is not just because it's fun to see the global in the Wikipedia that hasn't been seen before. We actually want to prototype some simple visual tools that help readers to look at a Wikipedia entry and, like the person who actually goes to a real estate entry, what level of confidence, what level of convergence, what level of divergence am I seeing in this history? It's not a lot to ask, but I think it's really important. The question for us is, if we put these things on history entries, does it undermine reader confidence or does it support reader confidence? And we don't know the answer to that question. So at the moment we've downloaded Wikipedia, and with thanks to the National Computational Infrastructure in Australia, our high-performance computer, we are crunching the data as we speak. It's a real case. I never imagined in my life as a theoretician that I would be using high-performance computing. But I realised in my career, it's one thing to have a theory. The better thing is to test the theory, to see if it's true. And the even better thing is to turn that theory and that test into simple visual tools that users can use to support their right to study history safely, to encourage them to be creative and to see the possibilities. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. Mark, yeah.
Well, first, thank you very much. I have to kind of reorient my mind in order to stabilize it just to ask the question, but I guess I have two. One is, what is the difference between literature and history?
What an outstanding question. So for a long time, history theory has really focused on history as narrative, really studied plot line and genre and thoughts about this. So Hayden White got us all excited about that in the 1970s. And so we've traditionally looked at history that way. I agree that histories have kind of literary forms of expression. I totally agree with that. I think, though, that focus has been to the disservice of the rules of reasoning and the logic that historians use. So it does overlap with literature in that it does have narrative, it has plot line, it has all of those things. But it's the rules of reasoning that I'm focused on. What I can't tell you is, because I haven't been out there reading literary prize books, is what rules of reasoning people might be using in great novels, for instance, to see whether there is. But that is a question you could definitely ask. Do they trade in the same currency? Do they use different? Yeah.
I mean, I guess for me, that ambiguity, that uncertainty, almost the speculative nature of it could have,
Yep.
you know, if Holland's ports hadn't frozen and Napoleon couldn't have moved his soldiers, we would never have Louisiana and we would look like Portugal and
Yep.
just that imaginative, now that isn't what happened, but that contingency. So I think Chat 5 is actually quite interesting, and to me, I don't know if Chat 5 has creativity or is so good at imitating creativity that it appears to me creative. So as an example, I would ask Chat 5, how would a dyslexic thinker improve the speed of a horse?
Yep.
And it would say it would invent a car. To me, I think it's a very creative answer versus make the horse stronger, feed the horse better food, whatever is out there. So it has flashes of creativity, not the contingency that you're talking about and the speculative nature of it, but it does, I don't know others in the room, and I'm probably not articulating very well, but it does feel that it borders on the creativity of that contingent if.
Yep. And it's just expressed differently. But the interesting thing is, so that K parameter that's sitting behind that, which you can fine tune, give me the wilder answer or give me the more constrained answer there. The problem is the end user is I can't see the tuning on that, right? Is the scenario question the permission to loosen the parameter or not in that case? I can't discern. And I've got no cue to tell me whether that's the case. And you go, oh yeah, of course it would invent a car. There's no ifs or buts or maybes about it. The thing, by comparison with somebody like Tia Miles, the historian, she says, yeah, it could have been this, or it could have been that, or it could have been that, or it could have been that. And there's a small number of, as you know, LLMs that give you more than one answer. They're really interesting. But if you compare the answers, they're often basically identical. So the great example I've got in the book is visual representations of historians. This is actually really quite good fun. If you go and ask generative AI, draw me a picture of an historian, it's quite depressing actually. The ones that produce multiple frames, so OpenArt will produce, two little sepia, they're always sepia, historians seem to live in the past, two little sepia frames, and it'll produce two men wearing Wild Wild West outfits, which is kind of really cool. And the difference between them is the type of tie they're wearing, which is really cool. And if you say, actually, I noticed that they're both men, it'll then produce two women, and one's wearing a necklace and one's wearing earrings. So the base is they're so similar that you just wonder whether the training set's pulling you back to, this is it, and I'm just going to give you this little difference on the edge there that you can't see. So that's the case where the parameter's been really, really ratcheted down to say an historian wears a tweed suit, and there's pictures of them in the book, wears a tweed suit, sits in their office and writes with a quill. And that's the picture you get. And if you say, I notice it's a man, it then produces a picture of a woman who's got a wedding ring, so that's cool. She's also wearing a tweed suit, she's got a wedding ring, and she has a typewriter on the side. Little tiny tweaks. Same thing. So yeah, I agree. It depends on the tuning. And the problem is, as a user, I can't supercharge that tuning. I'd love to be able to do that. Give me a dashboard where I say, ramp it right up. Give me crazy, give me less crazy. The better example I'll give you is Meta AI about 12 months ago was just downright crazy. And they've tuned it right down. But 18 months ago, 2 years ago, it was just really wild. Asking Llama anything, it would just give you completely ridiculous answers, and you thought 1 in every 10 times it's going to be fabulous. And the other 9 times it was completely crazy. But it's settled down. Now the question up the back.
Yeah, thank you. That was such a fascinating talk. My question builds very much on the previous one, and it may be somewhat repetitious, but as you were speaking, I found myself thinking,
Yeah. So and I want to thank the colleagues in data and decision science this morning, very patiently talking about causality with me. And one of the things that really came out nicely this morning was talking about the difference between individual agentic causality and systemic causality. So at what even scale do you decide to explain things? And the example I gave this morning was, so this week, sadly, we're coming towards the anniversary of September 11. It's a really powerful an important piece of history in the US. If you were writing a book about September 11, would you write around 3,000 people? Or would you write around one? Now, the majority of the texts have written around one person, 6 people. Brought it back to the individual agentic level in that case, which is really interesting. So one of the things I find interesting about history is it tends to the smaller scale, might assume that the macro scale and the micro scale are incompatible, which they're not. There's kind of just a grounded rule of reasoning that it says don't cross the laser beams and go into global history if you're writing micro history. But if you go and look at, for instance, environmental histories, so I went and looked at the George Marsh Perkins Prize, which is fabulous, you find people skipping scales really interestingly, and they've taken a leaf out of that anthropological. They position themselves on the first couple of pages. So the first person is present really strongly in the book to establish the frame. And then they scoot up to the global and then scoot down. So just by crossing over from anthropology and geography into history, you notice people trading slightly differently. And then if you look at economic global histories, you'll find people that might be using graphs with uncertainty error bars in there. So people do cross over into these different languages when they express. The one that I find really interesting is that they are still trading in uncertainty. They're just the expression of that might be slightly different. You know, in the first case, it's my personal position, I. So it's what I'm seeing, but maybe not what you're seeing. In the latter, there's an error bar on the graph, and we're both agreeing. So the rules of reasoning are still there, they're just taking on different expressive forms in those cases. So history's predilection for borrowing and connecting with different methodologies is really useful and helpful. Now, what I haven't done and what I'd love to see is people doing it from the opposite side. So people who are writing in literature who are walking into historical frames or anthropological frames, do they borrow the same rules of reasoning? Put them on for a moment. I don't know, I really don't. It's such a good question that you're asking, that if you did it for anthropology, what would you see? If you did it for this. And I couldn't honestly advise you and say, if you're an anthropology professor, how could you tell if your students were using Gen AI? I couldn't say with confidence that I'd know how to answer that question. Yeah, I don't. Up the back.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. It's so interesting, and I love the examples that you were bringing together. You know, one of the things, this is really just another way of asking a very similar question, but I think it's really at the core of what you're trying to say. And it's an invitation to talk a little bit more about the differences between statistical uncertainty and uncertainty as historians or anyone in the humanities understands it. Because one of the things that I am continually struck when reading someone like T. Miles or Cynthia Hartman is how precise it is. It's because they take one different entry point, they must hold themselves up to a standard that is so much more rigorous and so much more documented and so much more precise than anyone else who may be starting with the common entry point.
Yep.
And it seems to me that large language models, you know, because they are bound by statistical probabilities, have less of an ability to pick a different entry point and are really constrained by their ability to only select within this, as we know, sort of constrained probability space, which I think in some ways is fundamentally at odds with the historical project. And so I think I just want you to tell us a little bit more about how you see those two, what I see as like sort of very different understandings of what uncertainty is coming together.
Yeah, thank you. That is such a great question. So in the book, I actually do talk about Aristotle's view of what he calls endoxa, so the grounded beliefs of people. And he's quite clear. He says an endoxon can be by consensus or it can be by esteem. So a single person might be esteemed for what they've argued versus everybody. Now, what's interesting is that AI trades on the consensus, so the statistical probabilities, And what we've forgotten is what you all would call the black swans. We in Australia would call them white swans, because we don't have white swans, right? So just a reminder of perspectivism across the world. So you're absolutely right. The historian is interested in the anomaly, not the consensus. But we could also be interested in consensus. I think we typically will look for the unusual. We will document the details in the way that I think we're used to for history. I think that's superb. But there's nothing incompatible between that and also looking at machine learning, applying those models and saying, do I see something different in that space as a challenge to our own practice? So there's actually no prohibition on Bayesian thinking in historiography. It's just that people tend not to do it. I'm keen as a historiographer to say, you could do it. You might not like the result. You might have ethical questions about it because you might believe that intentional, agentic individuals are where we need to trade, but there's no prohibition on it. So I agree with you. There's all of that finely wrought, beautiful work that's so detailed. But I'm wondering, in this age of AI, our craft, which is so beautiful, are we missing a trick there where we could actually be doing large data with our students as well? Not at the expense of what you're talking about, but in addition to. I'm quite keen to see how we can embrace an era more of scale shifting in historiography. Can I do that beautiful work around one person, two persons, in the way you've just talked about? But also, could I use machine learning? And if I put those two things together, just imagine what I might get. It might be that that big picture is not as creative, you're right. But if I put the two things together, I might see an aspect of history that I've taken for granted in the past. And that's what I'm quite keen to get to. And my last book was actually on the relationship between scales and ethics in history. This is a really under-realised area. I think we can shift a lot more, and you do see historians shifting scales really beautifully. But I think we could really amplify that in the age of machine learning and shift scales quite dramatically. So I agree with you, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Thank you. Noting, I'd also say too, the way historians use conditionality, it's not probability, it's not computable, and it's not like fuzzy logic where you can line it up and say if means 5%, might means 10%, although nobody's done that work. If I consistently put the words should, would, must, possible, maybe in front of historians, could you put them in order of certainty for me? Nobody's ever done that. It'd be really interesting to do that. I would note, though, that when you put modals like could, should, might together with pronouns, so it, so historians like using the word it rather than I or we, so the artificial first person, which I love, they tend not to use the strong modals like the musts and the shoulds. They use the possiblies, the mights. So historians have a slightly more constrained modal range than you might be able to use more fully. And I suspect that's that diplomacy piece that we're trying to say to people, I acknowledge your work, but I'm not going to take you on in a massive fight. I'm just going to gently put it out there that I've got a different view to you. So some of what we do is not just because we're beautiful writers, we also do want to be diplomatic with one another as well. And that's something that's actually not been much studied either, to be honest with you. And that would be really interesting, is to compare pronouns and modals to see whether people do this for diplomatic reasons. Yeah.
We have time for
one more question. Apologies, talking too long. Yeah.
Talked earlier about the morale. To me, morale can be very subjective depending on the historic period, depending on the region that you're in.
Yeah.
So let's say you use black swan and white swan. So if I'm in Australia and I ask a question, the AI is giving me a historical response depending on the region I'm in. How do we get to the actual truth there? How do we not get it so subjective that, hey, if you're hearing history from this side of the world and that side of the world, it's a different history because of what the AI has been trained on, depending on where you're at, or the knowledge that it's been given.
I love your question because this is exactly something I asked in the book. If I turned location off, it would give me a US answer. So in the book, I asked a range of Gen AI tools. I looked at all kinds of AI, by the way, machine learning, but also Gen AI, and I asked AI to, for instance, write the opening paragraph of an environmental history that's going to win the Perkins Prize. Actually, it was really interesting, for the Berkshire Prize for Women's History, could you write the dedication page in the first person? Just quite remarkable. In environmental histories, if I didn't put location, I'd say, please, could you open the book that's going to win the Marsh Prize, and could you use different pronouns? And it would always say things like, my grandmother grew up on a tobacco farm. 9 out of 10 times. And I go, okay, in Australia, we don't do tobacco farms. If I set location, it would say, my grandmother grew up on the banks of the Brisbane River. Oh, that's pretty good. You've actually put your finger on something really big there, which is the majority of the data set, the majority of AI users in the world, the majority of web data comes from the US and the EU. It does not come from Australia. If I tell it location, it may give me a little bit more, but it's interesting, about 8 weeks ago, the tech reporter from El Pay interviewed me about the book, and he goes, I'm Spanish. And I said, well, yeah, you're writing from El Pay. And he goes, I want to know whether AI is going to give us a really good Spanish history, or whether I will be an American historian within 2 months. He was really interested in this question of whether history would become homogenized to a US point of view because of the predominance of the data set coming from. And just to put it more specifically, he was from Catalan. So he wanted a Catalan view of history, not a Spanish view of history. He didn't want an EU version. He didn't want a US version. That's a really important question. I can't answer it for the moment, but I think intuitively, I would say to you as an Australian that AI is American data. And it potentially is. That's the geopolitical stake, that we're all trading information at the moment. And those who have the information may be the ones that write the winning side. Yeah? Maybe I'll stop there.
Would you join me in thanking Professor Hughes-Warrington?
Thank you.
I'd also like to say thank you again to Bianca Bell and Mark Bell for sponsoring this talk. Please join me if you are able in the next room. There's a small reception, and we'll have an opportunity to talk more and continue the conversation there.
Okay, there we go. Cool.
That was great.
That was all right?
Fantastic. Absolutely.
Sorry for coming late.
Thank you for coming.
I'm with the Carter Center.
Oh, hey.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.